Okay, joining me today is none other than Coach Cadd. Now, one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on the podcast is because when I first started working as a PT just over a year ago, I believe you were one of the first coaches that I ended up following on Instagram. And mainly one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on is because your content is amazing. I mean, yeah, it's actually got the right blend of humor and fitness. Like the other day I was showing my buddies this video that you made on TikTok of a girl, and she's like got hot. She's putting hot water over the hockey, and you're having a what is it? You're having a sip of your tea, and all of a sudden you start cringing. I pretty much almost had the same reaction. That's no, I wouldn't do that to a poor food like that, you know. Anyway, man, how you doing?
I'm really good. Thanks for having me on the show. Yeah, look, it's been an interesting game, the an interesting beast, social media, as I'm sure a lot of good sides, a lot of bad sides. TikTok's been really interesting because it's obviously a lot different to my normal content. And you can't go quite as deep on things, but people generally tend to like the upfront reactions. And with TikTok there's a lot of different things that give you a lot of different reactions, so it always keeps you on your toes a little bit. But thank you, mate, I appreciate that, saying that about my content. I try and put out as much stuff as I can there, but I also sometimes get caught in trying to figure out who I'm creating content for. Like, I love obviously diving deep on the technical side of things, but I also try and bring it back to what's actually usable and practical for people as much as possible. So looking forward to diving into some stuff.
Awesome. So that's what I wanted to ask you, like straight away. Like, TikTok's kind of just exploded within the last year or so. I reckon a lot of it had to do with COVID and when everyone was in isolation at home making videos. So that's something we will talk about. But I wanted to ask you, I personally do not use TikTok, or do I have TikTok? As asking someone who's used it, has it actually benefited you as a strength coach in terms of a business standpoint?
Yeah, so actually, it TikTok, I never thought I'd say this. TikTok has been the best thing I ever did for my business.
Wow.
And especially when I started initially I started posting some stuff on TikTok, and I was like, I can just upload like an exercise video a day or something. And then, I did what a lot of us do, and I just didn't post for like a year. And I came back to it at the start of COVID, and started actually seeing there was a few guys, like, I don't know if you've come across like this guy in Australia called Brockfit.
Mm-hmm.
And he's a good, another Australian, just on the app, like just spitting absolute banter, right? And it was nice to see a couple of Aussies on there, especially in the fitness space, and they had really good followers. And I was like, wow, people are actually on this app. Young kids especially are on this app, genuinely looking for as much information as they could find, right? So that kind of inspired me to dive into it a little bit deeper. And like I said, it has been a bit of a mixed journey of some of the good and some of the bad, but overwhelmingly it's been great. Like, it's probably not related directly to a huge amount of clients, because the majority of the niche isn't who I'm really working with. It's a lot of quite young kids on there who are just looking for information. But I have definitely gotten I've definitely gotten a lot of inquiries. I've definitely actually gotten a few clients from TikTok who have gone on to be some of my best clients, most dedicated clients. A lot of the people you'd probably work with as well, young guys, and from an athletic background are some of the most dedicated athletes you'll get, or dedicated clients that you'll get. And then it's been really good for exposure, and like I'm really working on now building YouTube, because I feel like I can provide a lot more valuable information on YouTube, and that's kind of where my passion is. The 15-second reaction videos are fun on TikTok, but I really like, Instagram and YouTube allows me to have a lot more in-depth and nuanced conversation with potential clients, or just providing as much information as I can.
That's actually good to hear, because considering now social media has really exploded a lot for businesses, and I've had social media marketing experts come on, and they talk about why social media has now become such a valuable tool for business. Like, or how would you rate like social media for you? Like, is it something you want to focus on a little bit more in terms of gaining clients, or is it just something you rather do as a hobby?
Yeah, well, that's actually a really good question. That's one that I've had to ask myself a lot of times over the past like year since COVID really hit. But to be honest, like for me, I'm entirely online now. Like we were saying kind of before we started, I'm in Denmark now. I might be in Croatia in a few weeks, and then hopefully back to Denmark or Germany, depending on how visas go. So the shift into online business has been amazing for me. And so these days, I've got a couple of different business projects that I'm kind of working on. I obviously still work one-on-one with clients. I've got a group of other coaches called the Fit Talkers, who we run a kind of a membership group coaching program, which I'm really excited about. But social media is definitely taking on more of a life of its own for me. I think within the next few years, I'll definitely be primarily in education and content creation. I am taking on a handful of clients, but it's definitely not the direction I think I'm going to see over the next few years, especially. So, yeah. What about yourself? Have you found the social media side kind of take on its own life during COVID?
Yes and no. Okay, so personally, I've only been working as a coach for just over a year. So I'll give you a little bit of my background. I graduated from university last year, and since then I've been working on full time as a strength coach, and also having a lot of other jobs on the side. For me personally, because of the way that my system's run in my gym, most of my clients come in through the door. I've had a few people come to me online. I have not got any online clients whatsoever as of now because I'm still learning, which is one of the questions I'm still going to ask you about later on. But mainly right now, it's just about establishing a strong client base, establishing a niche, and then keeping a busy schedule going. And eventually, then I can start to go up. Because what I've been told is, I don't know if you would agree with this, but for some reason, most PTs, like the average lifespan is usually 2 years for some reason. Like if you make it past the first 2 years, then you're officially involved in the job. Do you agree with that statement?
Well, so a little bit of myself. I actually used to teach the personal training and massage course. So I went through all my education, went and worked as a coach for a long time, came back and did my massage qualification, and then started teaching the the massage and personal training qualification at the Institute of Fitness. And so something that I could really see when I was teaching the course was that already from the day you kind of walk through the door, who's going to be successful in the industry long term, and who's not. Right. And the biggest thing is not how jacked someone is. It's not how passionate they are, but it's whether or not they're treating it like a business. And so often you see all these people, and I assume this is a little bit of your background as well. Like I started off in strength. I started off in sports. I played basketball and I played footy. I played volleyball, and then that kind of transitioned into the weights room. And that's a really natural and really healthy transition for people into the fitness industry. But you're not actually, with the exception of you're probably not going to work with your dream clients, right? And it's not enough to just be someone who's excited about sport. If you want to be a good coach, you actually need to learn, hey, this is how I'm going to train the 99% of the people who don't have a sporting background, who want to improve their health. And you actually needed to approach it with a business mindset. Like at the end of the day, it is going to be about, exactly like you said, it's going to be about putting in a lot of work. I keep going to swear. I'm not sure if I can. It's going to be putting in a lot of work, right? And then it's going to be about, grinding long hours. And it's going to be about getting your financial systems in place. And it's going to be about how many sales you can actually convert, and how many people you're actually having sales conversations with. And no one really wants to have those conversations because, especially on social media, we want to come across like we're doing it for the love and the passion, which we definitely are. But at the end of the day, it's also nice to have love and passion for what you do, but also be able to pay your bills. And I think that's something, I don't know if you've experienced this as well, but it's something that I struggle with a lot is actually, I've been a coach for 10 years now. But still, when I'm in a conversation with a client and it comes to are you willing to pay for my services? It's still a completely different conversation we kind of have to have with ourselves as well, because it's not an easy part of the job.
No, definitely like money. Well, one thing personally for myself, when I actually started this, that it doesn't really, sometimes for some coaches, like, it doesn't really matter how knowledgeable you are, how many accreditations you have, how many like years of study you've done, like if you got it. Talking about money and negotiating is a complete other skill on its own. And that's something that I've come to learn the hard way, because like, there's a saying like almost everything in life can be a negotiation, and you make all these decisions within a day. Like when it comes to money, that's where a lot of people definitely do struggle. So if not to get like too personal, but like what's if you were, for someone who's been coaching for 10 years, and a lot of my audience are people who are involved in the fitness industry as well, like what's some advice you can give someone when it comes to like closing that deal with a client?
Yeah, look, the biggest thing that I would say is that it really has to come from just playing a numbers game. Like at the end of the day, it's not going to come down to what you're doing, any kind of magic. And there are definitely business coach and sales coach that you can go to that will like teach you different quote unquote techniques. But at the end of the day, if you're relying on a technique to close a deal with someone who you're going to be developing a long-term relationship with as a client, it's probably not a great strategy, right? If you're just trying to sell solar panels to someone, all you need them to do is sign on the line, you're done, right? But if you're actually wanting to be the good and the bad thing about the industry that we're in is that you actually care about your clients, right? And a lot of times they will become almost, if not friends of yours during that journey, because you're going to be spending a lot of time with them. You're going to be going through a lot of different emotional kind of roller coasters with them as well. So I don't think anyone should fall into that trap of trying to trick people or do anything too crazy when it comes to marketing. I don't know if this is good fitness advice, but I've always been quite upfront with my session prices. Like I've always charged a reasonable, like probably towards the higher end, for at least for the environment I'm in. But I'm always upfront about that. And, some people can't afford it. A lot of people aren't willing to put it high enough priority to afford it. And that's an important conversation to have. Like if you're working with a client and they can really, really want to work with you, but if their number one priority is going on a holiday, then they're probably not going to do what it takes, right? And it's about having that open, honest conversation going, okay, well, here's where your priorities seem like they are right now. Does that sound right to you? And if they say, look, I'm just not willing to invest in myself right now, then it's not your person. Like, I think we beat ourselves up a lot about, trying to, you can drive yourself crazy trying to figure out those like closing conversations or whatever. But at the end of the day, I mean, if the person's not right for you, then go out, chat to someone else, get yourself out there on social media, whatever you need to do to just have a sit down with another person. Because you'll also know this as well. Like you get some client and you'll go back, and this is one of the downsides about TikTok is you get a lot of people who want information for free, right? There are a lot of young kids. I totally get it. I've been there. And they want to just message you a million questions, but they're not willing to actually pay for anything, right? But then you get someone else come along. I just started a client recently who's a young AFL player from Melbourne. And he messaged me out of the blue. He saw me on some kind of social media, messaged me out of the blue, said, I'm going to sign up, bang, 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 put through a payment. We started. He's been hands down one of my best clients. Fills in all of his sheets. Everything's on time. He's paying, he's just, everything's perfect. Pays on time, does what he needs to do, executes. And that's the thing is really the clients that you have to chase are probably not the clients you want. But if you're putting in the work for long enough, you'll draw in the people that you want, right? They'll come to you and they'll be the best clients that you'll have.
That's good answer. So let's rewind the clock a little bit. You're entirely online, okay? You said you've got a handful of clients that you train in person. So let's can you give us like a little bit of an insight to your background and how you got to this point where you're completely online?
Yeah, 100%. So I've been a coach, like I said, for kind of 10 years now. Like that, I feel like I don't feel like I'm getting on an age, but every time that number goes up, it kind of tells me, it's happening. So I started, like I said, I was playing primarily volleyball and basketball. I used to play some AFL, but I wasn't any good at it. So that was just mucking around. And I kind of got to this point at about 15 or 16 where I was playing in all these big man positions in sport, but I wasn't big anymore. Like I stopped growing, all the competition around me kept growing, and I was like, well, this isn't going to work out, right? So I kind of got into the weight room and tried to get an advantage elsewhere. No one else, they were all tall and skinny, so I was like, at least if I can put on some size, I'll have some weight to throw around. And it kind of took off from there. Like I started writing programs for my friends. We started working out the local footy club gym at lunchtime. And I started to very quickly realize that I was more interested in the intelligent design of a program, more so than I was about necessarily executing the program, right? And that's a good sign that I'm probably not going to be a great athlete, because I wasn't that excited to do the work. I was more excited to think about some of the theory behind it, right? So so that's kind of where it took off. And I was actually at the point of, kind of 17 or 18 looking at applying for university, and I've always been really interested in kind of biology and the sciences. So the options for me, I was looking at either psychology or parasitology, which is actually the study of like parasites, which is one of my favorite little nerd out topics. And I used to post a lot of that stuff on my social media. I haven't talked about obscure biology facts in a while, which was actually the direction I was going to take my TikTok entirely at the start. So I'll have to come back to some of the weird parasite facts soon. But yeah, so I was going to do parasitology or psychology, but I looked at both of those careers and I was like, realistically, I didn't like the end goal. I like the idea of psychology, but to spend your entire time working one-on-one with clients, sitting down, talking about feelings, essentially, I'm sure it's very rewarding, but it didn't really see myself wanting to do that for the rest of my career, right? And then parasitology is even worse, because you either end up completely in a lab staring through a microscope, or you end up in the backwater of Borneo or Kenya or something, cutting open a frog and counting the amount of different kind of worms inside it. And like, I love travel, but I like, traveling to Japan, where you've got toilets that talk to you while you're doing what you need to do, and vending machines that feed you beer, not like setting up in a mosquito infected, parasite ridden village somewhere. So I stuck with PT, right? That was what I was kind of doing as a passion anyway. I followed that through, and 10 years later, I'm kind of here. I mean, we can dig into that process as much as you want to, but yeah, essentially I got started like everyone. I did my 12-week course that we kind of have to do. I think there's lots of different options these days, but I did my 12-week or 16-week or whatever in-person course, and then just got chucked out into a big chain gym and kind of had to swim for the surface like a lot of us.
Good for you. Now, obviously you've got the credentials, working 10 years in the industry, so time-based. So the next part of the podcast, I just want to ask you about some questions about some of the stuff that you put out there. Now, recently you put out a really good post about blood flow restriction training. I'll confess, I've never used or never done blood flow restriction training. It is not something I'm educated on a little much, or know very lack of. So this is personal. This is a question for a person gain, or also for my viewers. But can you give us like an in-depth breakdown to what is blood flow restriction training, and is it a valuable tool?
Yeah, absolutely. So blood flow restriction is a really interesting one. And actually, this is a sentence I probably don't get to say very often, but TikTok taught me a little bit about it recently. So there was a few other creators that kind of put out videos saying how, pointing out some of they were basically anti-blood flow restriction. And obviously, as a response to that, I made a YouTube video that I wanted to do anyway, that I've been planning. But but I had to really take a pretty good deep dive into some of the literature we have. And so blood flow training is really interesting. So the basic premise is that you will use a tourniquet, and like, I don't recommend people do this too much at home. You can buy special blood flow restriction cuffs for it, and you can actually get quite advanced ones where you can track the amount of pressure. And if people are going to do it, I definitely recommend looking at that, because then there's no risk for error, right? But what you basically do is you attach the tourniquet quite high up on a limb, so whether that's your arms or your legs, and it cuts off or restricts blood flow down to that limb. right? And if you guys have done if anyone listening kind of has done biology, they know that blood flows kind of away from the heart into the limb and then circulates back towards the heart. And so what happens by restricting the amount of blood flow back to the heart, we actually we create what's called a local hypoxic environment, where you've basically got this blood going into the muscle, but as you're contracting the muscle, we've got a buildup of the metabolites, or the waste product from muscle contraction, that is unable to leave that limb, right? And to sort of put that in context where people, athletes have probably experienced this before, that burning feeling that you get when you're contracting a muscle. We talk about it like we call it lactic acid, but it's actually kind of an accumulation of metabolites and hydrogen ions and things like that. But it gives you that burning feeling. And then as soon as you stop your set, all of that rushes back to the heart and it can be filtered by the body. Basically runs around the body and it can be filtered by the body. So using the restriction bands, and it's also called occlusion training, blood flow occlusion training. It basically traps those metabolites in the muscle, and it forces the muscle to I guess continue to contract and to continue to work, even in a pretty limited capacity, right? So basically, it's essentially like, if you tried to run your car on a really small amount of fuel. Now, unfortunately, this is not how it works, but if you do that for long enough, then theoretically the body starts to learn how to be more and more efficient with the fuel that it has, right? Obviously, the car analogy falls down a little bit there, but I hope that kind of helps put things in perspective, right? So that's the concept. And the theory there is that when you're actually, and it's not necessarily to do with performance, but when you trap the metabolites into the body, we tend to see this hypertrophy signaling, this muscle growth signaling, kind of upregulated. So, if for most of the time, if you're doing a set of 10, the first 5 to 6 reps are going to be pretty easy, right? If you're doing the next kind of 3 or 4 reps after that, that's when it starts to burn. That's where it starts to get hard. They're the most kind of quote unquote effective reps. Okay. So what the blood flow restriction does is it basically brings down your threshold for effective reps. Let's say you pick up a light weight and you could do that weight for 30 reps, right? It's going to get hard maybe at rep 22, it's going to start to burn. But if you actually tried to take a really light weight to failure, it would take a lot of work. So what the blood flow restriction does is it brings down that threshold to failure. So if that weight would normally take you 30 reps to go to failure, all of a sudden at 10 reps, it starts to get really hard. And then maybe 12 reps or 13 reps, it starts to get really, really, really hard. And maybe you're going to actual failure at around 15 reps instead of 30. And that's essentially where the value of blood flow restriction training is in bringing down that threshold with lighter weights, enabling you to get the same kind of muscle growth, theoretically get the same kind of muscle growth from a lightweight for 15 reps as a lightweight for 30 reps. Does that kind of make sense?
It does make sense. So that was a really, really good in-depth discussion to what it is. Now, have you experimented with this blood flow restriction training?
Yeah, so I've done a little bit of myself. So there's a couple of things that are worth having in this conversation. And I just kind of touched on this a little bit. Like I said, in the video I did, I included some of the TikToks that are being made out there, and some of the common pros and cons about these, right? So something that is worth knowing is that using blood flow restriction for muscle growth is really quite theoretical at this point. Okay, bodybuilders have been doing it for years for arm training, but we know that it gets you a sick pump, right? And that's great, but we also don't know we also know that that's not going to necessarily actually create extra growth. So if there's young guys listening to this in particular, they're already probably in the gym doing heaps and heaps of crazy drop sets and stuff to get a pump, and thinking that's going to make them grow. Now that's not always the case, and same for girls. They'll do. Females generally get marketed like glute finishes and stuff, where they'll do all these like hip pump kind of stuff to get blood flow into their butt or the booty, and it does feel like it's working, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's actually changing, right? So we come back to blood flow restriction. It gets you a sick pump. That's awesome. That doesn't necessarily mean you're going to grow from it. So what we've seen from an academic standpoint, what we've seen in the literature, is that blood flow restriction is very effective for growing muscle at low load. So you can use a lightweight and get a reasonable amount of muscle growth. Now, for people who are coming back from an injury, let's say they've shattered their elbow, or they've dislocated, they've done their ACL or something, like especially in your industry, I'm sure you come up with, or your niche in the industry, I'm sure you've seen some horrific injuries that luckily most of us don't have to deal with, to elbows and things, from people who potentially didn't tap out in time. But the good thing about blood flow restriction is we can put an injured joint through quite a good workout without having to load it up and put more stress on it. Okay. Now, the conversation that I talked about in my YouTube video is basically that we know that, right? So that works, but it's really important that we don't take studies that are done, in injured populations in a physiotherapist's office, and then try and extrapolate that to the average person walking into the gym, because we're dealing with two very different environments. We're dealing with people who need two very different stimuli to grow muscle. So while we don't necessarily we don't have a lot of studies showing direct hypertrophy in athletes or bodybuilders. We don't have any studies on bodybuilders yet, which is going to be kind of the final question that before we can conclusively say yes or no, this is useful. But we do have some early studies in athletes. We've got powerlifters who we're able to use lightweight front squats to hypertrophy, their type 2 muscle fibers in their quads. We've got rugby players who were able to increase their muscle using blood flow restriction. So we've got a theoretical basis for it, but we do know that it's still in its early days. So if people are looking at doing blood flow restriction, I definitely recommend that they keep it they include it as part of their workout, but I also don't think they should ever kind of fully, don't scrap the weights that you're doing now and move completely into blood flow restriction.
Awesome. So it can be used as a tool. It's in its early days. There's some study out there, but it's not yet proven to be an actual tool for building muscle growth if you're looking at it from a bodybuilding perspective. Okay. Yeah.
So what I would say is, and from my own experience using it, which was, sorry, to come back to your original kind of question, I've actually been using it when I'm in lockdown, for instance, to change the emphasis of the muscle I'm working. So anyone who's been through a lockdown, I think Perth, you guys had all of like a 6-hour lockdown or whatever you guys had to go through.
We had a week lockdown. Yeah, it was over one case though. Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
And that's funny because I was in Melbourne for the first lockdown and managed to avoid that. And then as soon as I got to Denmark, we went to lockdown. So I've been in lockdown for I think like 4 months. Well, 4 months now, and then the 3 or 4 months of Melbourne. So I think I didn't time my move over here. Trying to be in a long distance relationship and also move over line the global pandemic is probably not a great move, but you live and you learn. So I've been locked down for a long time, and to try and like use that, I've been doing some different, to try and make the best of that. I've been using some different methods. So for me, one of the things that I'll do at the moment is I will do some different kind of push-up variations, some pike and handstand push-ups and things like that. And then towards the end of my workout, to finish off, I'll put the blood flow restriction bands on my arms, and then I'll do some different methods and basically bang out a lot of push-ups at the end, right? And so by occluding the blood flow to my arms, I'm making that my limiting factor. If I could do 30 push-ups to, and I posted a clip about this on Instagram, so you might have seen it, but if I can do 30 push-ups before they start to get hard, then the blood flow restriction means that by the time I've done 12 push-ups, my triceps are on fire. And so by the time I get to 15, I'm already going to failure. I'm understanding that my chest and, my chest, my shoulders, my back, and all those supporting muscles are probably still going to be fine. But I'm making sure that the reason I can't do any more push-ups is because my triceps are fully fatigued. So with a bit of intelligent kind of playing around, if you're in a gym setting, then it's probably more simple. You can just slap them on your arms and go for it. I do know a lot of people, and a lot of the old school guys use blood flow restriction on your legs. I haven't tried that. That seems pretty brutal to go through, to cut off your whole leg and then jump on a 50 reps set of leg press. But I haven't tried that just yet.
I see. Okay, so it's definitely giving you some benefit. It's got it's a good tool, and it's still early days. And then, but the literature is still out there. Now, moving on from that, there was another post I really wanted to talk about. Specifically, when you posted, what is it? This was the tweet that I just brought up, which said, "Until you learn to properly, fully lengthen and shorten your lats, don't expect your back to grow." Now, I just wanted you to give us some insight to what do you mean by properly, fully lengthening and shortening your lats? Because when it comes to back training, I usually like to focus, if you're someone who's new into back training, focus on posture. Don't slouch your shoulders. Get used to retracting your shoulders and depressing them into a stabilized position. And then, of course, because that way, it minimizes that rock over or that swing you see a lot of people doing. Sometimes when they do, let's say, for example, is it bent over rows, or when they're doing seated rows. So what's your philosophy to that back training then?
These are really good questions, and they are they're they're big questions as well. So like even blood flow restriction, I was like, how do I? It's a big topic. I'm trying to go into it, but not too far into it. So if I go too far down a rabbit hole, feel free to pull me back, or the other way. If feel free to keep us going down there. Right. So my overarching philosophy, and obviously this changes a lot, right? Every year, every 6 months, every 3 months, I'll completely have to re-update my view on everything. And this has changed a lot. And this has been kind of the culmination of a lot of years of trying different things, right? But these days, I would very much like, if someone's reasonably new to the gym and they're listening to this, I want them to focus on moving their bones, not their muscles. Excuse me. That is an interesting concept, right? But if we start to look at the actual joint structure, we start to understand a lot of the muscles that lay on top of it, right? If you can understand more about your anatomy, how your entire, where muscles attach, where bones go, the rotation of bones, you'll learn so much more about yourself and how you can move. And something that I always work with my clients, when I'm working one-on-one with a client, a lot of our session is me teaching them about their own anatomy more than it is about teaching them how I want them to do an exercise. Because when you understand how your own body moves, you're able to achieve those outcomes in the most efficient way. Right. And you probably know this as well, especially from a martial arts standpoint, right? You can spend a long time telling someone how to throw a kick. But until they actually understand the weight of their own leg, the length of their own leg, the spacing between the opponent, which part of the body to initiate the rotation from, that's going to be hard. Like, you can teach someone how to kick, but if they're holding both of their arms out in front of them while they're trying to do it, it's not going to be a very powerful kick, right? So a lot of these movements have to come from the person understanding their own body. And so that's kind of my overarching philosophy. When it comes to that post specifically, I find back training to be one of the most complicated things for people, because there's a lot of different structures going on. The shoulder blades and their relationship to the body and the rib cage and the expansion and compression of the rib cage is very complex. There's a lot of different moving parts, right? But if someone was to pull up, and if someone is watching this on YouTube or something, by all means open a different tab and have a look at this while they're doing it. But if you look at the anatomy of the back and you look at where the lats actually go, it's often quite different to the picture that most people actually see. The lats don't connect onto your shoulder blades, they connect onto the upper arm, and they attach in this kind of, they attach even as low through the fascia to the bottom of the hip. So if you think from, the back underneath of your arm down to the top of your hip, we've got this massive sheet of muscle. And that's able to use a huge amount of force. But most of the movements that we think the lats do, they actually don't do very well. And you see one of the biggest mistakes, and again, I kind of posted a YouTube video on this because I think it's important. We don't actually see the lat doing a very good job of getting our elbow behind us. The lat's primary job is to essentially bring your elbow down to your hip. Okay, so there's a lot more nuance to it than that, but to go through it really briefly, like this understanding that your goal with a row is not to move the weight as far as possible, it's to actually fully shorten the lat muscle. And it's the same thing, like if we look at like bicep curls, so many people spend their time thinking about, okay, well, my goal here in a bicep curl is to lift the weight off the ground. And that puts in your head this picture of, okay, well, when I start, it's quite low, it's down by my thigh. At the end, I want it to be high off the ground towards my head. And that mindset of this is what a bicep curl is supposed to do, ruins your form. Like there is no way to do that in a way that's going to effectively load the bicep, because the bicep doesn't lift a weight off the ground. Your bicep closes the elbow joint. That's pretty much all it does, right? So if you can then go, okay, well, my goal with the bicep curl is not to lift a weight. It's to fully open and close the elbow joint. All of a sudden, we can start to build a better picture around what that muscle actually does. Okay, now there's a lot of different movements and a lot of different exercises and muscles, so it gets a bit more complicated than that. But if we look at, most knee flexion extension exercises, like your leg extensions, your hamstring curls, right? If people stop thinking about trying to lift the weight, trying to move the weight along the machine, and they actually think about extending and closing the knee joint, they're going to automatically get better form. They're going to get better results. Same for a bicep curl, same for a tricep extension, even, pressing movements, pulling movements as well, especially pressing movements is a big one for young guys in particular. They're not thinking about, okay, what joints and what muscles are actually working through this movement. They're thinking about how can I push the heaviest weight possible from position X to position Y. And I think it's quite a flawed way of looking at things. And it is going to make learning a technique a lot harder than approaching it from that kind of anatomy-based model to start.
Good. That's a very good way of answering that question. It's a big, deep philosophy to bat training. It's just for me, as a PT, I've always stressed the importance of the posterior chain, and a lot of it actually comes from the back. I talk about I talk about the importance of making sure that you've got a strong posture, because posture is something that's really is a massive tool when it comes to martial arts, and also making sure you have a strong upper back and then strong lower back, and making sure again when you're actually doing a back exercise, you try and go for that squeeze, and you try and actually, rather than using momentum, actually try and focus on contracting the muscle. So that's actually a really good insight. The next main point that I wanted to bring up was you posted a really good so put up a really good post on Instagram about what you know as the 3-7 method. Now having to read through this, I thought, wow, you've really got it nailed down. So if you could give us, I know try not to go down the rabbit hole too much, but if you could give us like a really short explanation to what is this 3-7 method and why it is that you promote it.
Yeah, absolutely. The 3-7 method, and this is actually, it's really cool that you're asking these questions. I've actually done I recorded a podcast about that last week, and so I'm launching a podcast with a friend of mine who's he's a personal trainer. He's been a coach for almost as long as I have. He's also studied biomedicine and now doing pharmacology. So it's a really interesting kind of deep dive, and I'm really enjoying taking a different approach to kind of some of these things. But we covered the 3-7 method as a standalone episode. And what we found was that in order to properly cover it, we do need to go down a lot of rabbit holes. So that was a good training for this podcast, basically. Cool. So one of the important things just to kind of understand when it comes to the 3-7 method is if we just take a really quick little brief look at the kind of mechanisms of hypertrophy. So we've got, and that sounds pretty fancy, but for you guys playing at home, it's basically like what actually makes muscle grow. And there's a simple answer for that we always get, but there's actually like obviously a lot of depth in that question. So there's two main drivers of hypertrophy, and one is mechanical tension. And that is basically, that's kind of always going to be our prime goal and our prime driver of muscle growth, which is actually how do you lift a weight in a way that actually translates that tension into a muscle. And kind of, we talked about that before, right? A lot of athletes will just focus on moving away as explosively as possible. And that may have some use for athletes, and that may be an important part of training. But if you actually want the muscle to grow, you're probably better off not doing it as explosively and actually focusing on lengthening and shortening the muscle, like we were talking about, right? So you're actually putting that muscle, that one muscle, under as much tension as possible. That's mechanical tension. We've also got metabolic stress, which is kind of what we talked about in the blood flow restriction, right? And metabolic stress is when it's more of a chemical reaction to a degree, where you're forcing those metabolites, that waste product that's building up in a muscle. We actually have pretty good evidence to suggest that does actually result in quite a lot of muscle growth as well. So we've got the actual mechanical tension, which we can think of as a bit more of a physical response. And then we've got the metabolic stress, which is kind of more of the chemical byproduct element, right? And that's just a really quick intro. But if we look at the 3-7 method, and this is a really interesting study that I think came out at the end of like 2019. And actually, it's an interesting one because it shook things up a little bit. But basically what they did is they took young males and they made them do bicep curls. And one group did 8 sets of 6 reps, and the other group did what's called the 3-7 method. So they did 3 reps, rested for 15 seconds. They did 4 reps, rested for 15 seconds, did 5 reps. They did that on and on until they got to 7 reps. Now that is a little bit interesting to wrap our heads around, but I think I don't know about you, but I think the first things that come to my mind are that's going to burn, right? And there are lots of different methods out there similar to this, but it's kind of that ascending method means that each set that you do gets a little bit harder, a little bit harder, a little bit harder, right? So that's the premise. And what they found was they actually found that the group doing the 3-7 method, now keep in mind, they only did 2 sets, but the other group did 8 sets. Okay, so each set of the 3-7 method probably took quite a long time. I think they were like 2 minutes in total. They did 2 sets, and that group actually got 75%, I think roughly about 75% more muscle growth than the other group. And the reason this caused a bit of a stir is because that's a very significant difference, right? There are not many things. Yeah, it's huge. There are not many things in the fitness industry that make that kind of promises and actually can deliver on it. So to actually see a study showing 75% improved muscle growth is crazy, right? But it's important to put that in perspective. So this is one of the things, like some of the things we went through in our podcast is it's a lot like some of the results we see with blood flow restriction training is that, yes, that's a really promising result. That's a really interesting result. But if we look at from an academic standpoint, we've got to look at what it was studied against. And so the other protocol for biceps was 8 sets with 6 reps. And I don't know about you, but that seemed like a very odd set rep scheme to choose for bicep training. Like, I don't know if I've ever given my clients something like that. I don't know if I've got many clients who would be willing to do 8 sets of 6 bicep curls. And, you know, in a UFC or in a fighting context specifically, there's very little carryover argument that you can kind of make for something like that. So we're probably comparing against not a great ideal, not a great standard. The reason they did that from a study standpoint is because the volume was equated. Both groups did about 50 reps. So from a scientific standpoint, it makes sense, but from an actual practical standpoint, we've got to ask the question, you know, is this actually going to be all that it's cracked up to be? So we would like to say, you know, it's this massive change to the fitness industry, and we should all do our training like this forever, and we'll all grow 75% bigger, because then we'd all be walking around looking like bloody monsters. But unfortunately, it's probably one of those things like blood flow restriction training that is a completely valid way of growing muscle. And it's probably going to be if you give it a crack, it's bloody hard. That was one of the things that I used to do. I tried to do with with the blood flow restriction bands, right? I put them on, and then I tried to do it with push-ups. And I didn't get particularly far into it, right? That got pretty spicy pretty quickly. So I gave up on that and just stuck to one or the other, the blood flow restriction. But for me, it raises a more interesting question, right? It's easy to get caught up in, and the reason I wanted to make that post on my Instagram was it's easy to get caught in the flash of the headline of, okay, 75% more muscle. But if we actually look at the practical conversation, I think what's more interesting is that for me, it raises that question around, okay, when you are training, how much is mechanical tension and how much is the pump, right? How much is that metabolic stress? And I don't think I'd be too far off the mark to say it's almost always going to be mechanical tension as our primary concern. But this and blood flow restriction training is a nod to say, you know what, maybe the pump is actually more valuable than we sometimes give it credit for. You know, maybe the bros were right in saying that getting a pump does actually lead to some initial growth. Because we've also seen, you know, kind of powerlifters go the other way, where they're only doing heavy weights, and some of them are jacked, right? But especially over the last few years, if we look at the rise of something like power building, and I don't know if the listeners have kind of come across this term where people are trying to train like powerlifters but also want to get big. It is trying to play all the games, right? So a lot of professional powerlifters are not going to be doing that, but it is about, you know, we're starting to see that even the best powerlifters in the world do get a lot of value from still training like a bodybuilder sometimes. And for athletes as well, you know, the majority of your off-season training, in my opinion, should be training like a bodybuilder. You don't want to do so much that you lose your touch with your sport or your skill. But I think for everyone, no matter what discipline you're in, you're going to get some value from training like a bodybuilder, trying to put on some size, and then learning how to use that new strength and power into your chosen sport.
Now that was a very, very good in-depth. Now, unfortunately, that's all the time I've got for right now. A client just walked in. But one thing I just want to put up is that one thing is, my viewers obviously going to want to view this podcast. So what I'll do is if you can send me that link, and I will put that in the description of this video as well. And man, I just want to say thank you very much for taking the time to come out. I appreciate you, your busy schedule, and all the best over in Denmark. And then eventually, hopefully, depending on, we'll catch up some point down the track for another in-depth discussion. So once again, man, just want to say thank you very much. And is there anything you would like to finish this podcast on?
No, mate. Thank you so much for having me on. That was really good to come on and throw a whole bunch of words at everyone in a very short period of time. So some really good questions there. I hope people have managed to take some value away from that. Of course, if anyone's got any questions, feel free to message me, and I'll do my best to go through things a bit more in depth. Look, you can check me out on, I mean, I'm everywhere on the internet. You can find me on Instagram. I've got, I think, 50,000 followers on TikTok. I'm really working on YouTube and trying to put out a lot of really detailed content there. So if people do have questions on anything we've talked about today, I've probably got a video on it on YouTube, or I've got a video coming. But I'm also potentially moving more into working with esport players and esport athletes as well. So if there is anyone listening who's in the gaming side of things, shoot me a message on Instagram, because I'm looking at taking on a few sponsored clients in the esport or the gaming streaming space. But also my content is going to be quite heavily directed, or different projects I'm working on are going to be directed down that line further, because I think a lot of esports athletes and streamers over the next few years we'll start to see a lot of them actually truly understand the value of fitness in the same way athletes, as UFC athletes didn't used to lift weights until pretty recently. Martial artists didn't like lifting weights until recently. And apart from that, I mean, I've got my group training program called the Fit Talkers, and if anyone wants to work with me, or either one-on-one or with the group coaching program, we can send me a message and we can look at doing that as well. So other than that, mate, thank you. I really appreciate you taking the time as well.
All good. No, my honor, man. Just one more thing before I let you go. Where can my audience find you? So we got your Instagram, and you said you had a YouTube channel. What's the name of your YouTube channel?
Everywhere you can find me at Coach Cadd.
Coach Cadd. Lovely. Awesome. Thanks again, man. Really appreciate it. All the best.